Okay, good morning. I hope you all got the different announcements yesterday. I'm sorry about the confusion. The topic I mentioned already the last time I want to do today are the weapons of World War I, even though it shows up later on the syllabus. I don't know why, because you'll see that the last topic, when we spoke about trench warfare, I mean, that ties in more directly with the different weapons of the First World War. I also want to step back just a bit um, because everything is sort of like a seamless web. Everything connects one thing to the other. And remember, it all began, at least the trench warfare began with the breakdown of the Von Schlieffen Plan. Von Schlieffen Plan is what led the German army through Belgium in violation of various treaties. And I just want to make one other point in passing. We spoke about the causes of World War I, but we really didn't discuss the war aims of Germany in World War I. Why did they start a war? So we did mention the fact that Germany is located right in the center of Europe, and the Germans felt that they were possibly besieged, or they would be besieged by the French on one side and the Russians on the other side, and perhaps the British. But that was all made up. That was really nonsense. It was just a justification. What the Germans wanted was what the Kaiser, what the emperor called their place in the sun. They wanted to have what every other big empire had, a lot of land and a lot of overseas territory. That's really what it's all about. And there was a whole question when it began, should it be an aggressive war or a non-aggressive war? Most of the very right-wing and militaristic parties and groups wanted it to be aggressive. They wanted to occupy land. They wanted to expand Germany. The more, at least on the surface, the more liberal parties, the socialists and so on, even though they were in favor of the war, they didn't want it really to be an aggressive war with Germany suddenly taking over every other country. They had other plans. They perhaps wanted some overseas territory. They wanted to become more powerful economically and commercially than, let's say, England and so on. But underneath it all was a sort of an aggressive attitude, and that included Belgium, because Belgium, to the German mind, was one country that they sort of all agreed has to be subdued, has to be occupied, because Belgium, they felt, was a threat to Germany. It was the gateway to England. It was the gateway to France. And this whole notion about these so-called Belgian terrorists amongst the citizens built up and, increased in the minds of the German people. And the idea was that Belgians really had to be taken care of. So, as we know what the Germans did in Belgium in World War I. And then in the march through Belgium on the way to France, they encountered the French army on the Marne River, M-A-R-N-E. The Marne is just north of Paris. And you remember that's when everything stalemated. It was known as the victory of the Marne. It wasn't a victory at all. It was it was a victory in the sense that the Allies stopped the Germans. But it wasn't an outright victory. No one could really claim success. It was a brutal, bloody affair. And all that happened, remember, was that both sides hunkered down and were stalemated and dug in, literally digging trenches. And that characterized the First World War on the Western Front. And that's why it lasted 4 years, because there was no movement. There were trench lines with the Germans on one side, there were trench lines with the French and the British on the other side, and there was no man's land in between. And the trench lines just got longer, and the conflict just sort of stagnated where it was for 4 whole years. And that is sort of the segue or the entry into the whole issue of weapons, because the weapons of World War I dovetail with the trenches of World War I. The weapons were horrific, and when you're stuck in a trench, it's more brutal because you can't move anywhere. And new weapons, as you'll see, were introduced in World War I that weren't necessarily effective in the beginning, but as the war moved on, they became more effective. They were modified and improved and so on. Modified and improved meant they could kill more, right? And those weapons of World War I then had an impact on World War II, as you'll see. And the one we're going to talk about specifically, which had probably the most memorable and horrific and deadly and brutal effect on the war, was poison gas, which has an interesting story that goes with it. And also we're going to see a brief documentary. It's actually posted on Blackboard, but we'll see it together. It's not that long, but it's a pretty good introduction to chemical warfare. I would can make a couple of comments though before we see it. So together with the weapons of the First World War, you have to talk about the technology of the First World War. Technology led to all these improved and more dangerous weapons. And that was a period in that time, in the beginning of the 20th century, when industry was improving, and it was an age of industrialization all over. So the improvements in industry and the better ways of producing, more effective and quicker ways of mass production, obviously also led to what we're going to talk about in terms of these new weapons and armaments. Now, this trend actually began in the American Civil War already, but it was really in World War I that the weapons and this technology emerged as a very important and vital force in the course of the war. As I said, in the early years of the First World War, there was sort of a clash between the new technology, new means of production, and more improved weapons, but the mindset of the army, of the generals, that was still back in the 19th century. So these were generals fighting a 19th century war with 20th century weapons, and not a good mix. Obviously, the situation in the beginning especially led to incredible numbers of dead and wounded, as we saw, because these generals just didn't adopt to the new mode of killing and of inflicting injury on the opposing side. And they were still fighting basically based on what had been passed down from previous centuries. So much so that you'll see that even in terms of the uniforms in the beginning of the First World War were absolutely absurd. It was almost comic. It weren't so tragic, basically. So they had to make changes. Along the way, obviously, things changed in terms of how the war was fought and the different strategies employed. We saw, when we talked about the trenches, that even the trenches improved and were modified and were adapted to the various situations in which these armies found themselves, and they became much more sophisticated, especially the German trenches. But they became, instead of single trench lines, then double and triple, with all sorts of dugouts behind the third trench line and the use of barbed wire in the front, and improving the going over the top, leaving the trench into no man's land with the parapets that were made out of wood and other constructions that prevented soldiers from just slipping down back into the trench, and ways of preventing the trench walls from collapsing because of the horrible, climactic conditions and the slush and the snow and the rain and everything else. So the trenches themselves had to be updated, and they were as the war went on. So too the different armaments, the different modes of killing, and so on. So there were many changes in terms of firepower that we'll talk about, in terms of rifles that were updated and more rapid fire than they'd been previously. Hand grenades were pretty crude. They existed for a long time, but they were crude in their structure. But as the war went on, the First World War, even the hand grenades were improved in terms of their effectiveness. Someone mentioned last time in the chat, good point. You don't want to be sitting in a trench when a hand grenade suddenly is lobbed in. It's not all that easy because of all the land in between. No man's land, you're throwing it. It's a hand grenade, you're throwing it, you're tossing it, but that didn't mean, it didn't cause plenty of destruction and death, especially if it actually landed inside the trench. But that was just one of the many projectiles that posed a great threat to soldiers who were hunkered down in these different trench lines and so on. So it was a hand grenade, and that was improved as well. And then because of the nature of warfare, the trench lines, as I said, had to be improved and reinforced and so on. They developed what was known as a concrete pillbox. It was a hard concrete block-like house that could be used to deliver machine gun fire, because machine guns were another great development in World War I. And these machine guns would be placed inside these concrete, what known as pillboxes, and with a hole in the front, obviously, to direct the front of the machine gun towards the enemy lines and just fire across. So those pillboxes were yet another addition to the trench lines and so on. And as we said, once enemy positions could be determined, they had to come up with other ways to infiltrate the trenches. So they started digging underneath and tunneling right underneath no man's land, right into the enemy trench. Trouble with that was that very often the earth and no man's land collapsed right on top of the trench, burying everyone who was digging through. But some of these tunnels actually made their way. So it was a rather unique war in terms of all these novelties and new developments and so on. But it was a stagnant, static, stalemated war. And like I said, when you're stuck in one place, underground, basically, and all of these new modes of attack have appeared from the ground and from above the ground, talk about airplanes. It's a pretty frightening situation. And then there were the other things, we'll talk about the flamethrowers and projectiles, and all these really horrible new armaments. And, you know, when you're stuck in the trench and these things are whizzing over your head, there's not only the issue of physical harm and death, there's a psychological component as well, because when you're down below, you can't see what's coming across from up above. And the fear and apprehension caused what was known as shell shock. Physical, I mean, psychological response to what was going on. You could lose your mind. And when you're stuck in the trench for long periods of time, it becomes worse. It's cabin fever. You know, if you're stuck and enclosed in a small area for an extended period, you know, you start to lose it, especially when you have to worry about what's coming at you that you can't see. And draw a parallel, I guess, to unfortunately what the world has been through of late, hunkered down, and not nearly as bad as being in a trench, but locked down. And in some ways, there is an analogy, because unfortunately, this pandemic is, it sees, but it can't be seen. It sees its victims. It's out there. It's all over the place. And you can't necessarily see where it is. Hence the need to lock down and cover your face and everything else. So you can sort of analogize it to a situation back in the early part of the 20th century when these soldiers were restricted in the very narrow confines of a trench, and they knew at some point things were going to be heading their way, but didn't know when and where. So I guess that'd be the closest analogy I can think of at the moment, but obviously very frightening situation. As I said, in the beginning, these generals were fighting a 19th century war in a 20th century context, which meant, as I mentioned, even the clothing of warfare hadn't changed in the beginning. And the French would wear their red, white, and blue tricolored uniforms as they charged across, and bright red and bright blue are, pretty visible. So you're basically setting yourself up to be massacred. And the British, even in the beginning, were using their blue uniforms. The Germans earlier on figured this is not a great idea, and they were the first really to use khaki-colored uniforms that would blend in with the landscape, so you weren't as visible, as clear a target. But it took the French and the British a while to figure that out. And so eventually they also adopted camouflage uniforms and either khaki colored or brownish or whatever, so that they would be less distinguishable from the landscape around them. And then other things, I mentioned the famous trench coat, because the trench coat was made only for the top guys, for the generals, even though they're called trench coats, and generals weren't in the trenches. But the climactic considerations and the constant rain and the cold and everything else, the need to carry all sorts of things with you if you're in charge, all the maps and the strategies and everything else, you need all these different pockets. So the trench coat appeared from World War I, and that's how it got its name. Also, in the beginning of the war, the armies really on both sides were using the headgear that they used always, which was basically made out of cloth. Cloth isn't exactly a great protector against flying objects from above. And then both sides at some point realized we need something more substantial. And because metallurgy, the science of mining and so on, had improved greatly in the 19th century, it was suddenly determined that maybe we ought to be using metal helmets in the course of the war rather than cloth, at least to some degree protect the head of the soldier, right? The Germans earlier on figured this out, and they came up with that famous German helmet. It's the Pickelhaube, literally the pickle bonnet, right? It has that thing sticking out of the top, because back when warfare was more mano a mano. You actually came right up face to face with the enemy. This way you could turn your head down, stick your metal protruding knife-like projection right into their gut or whatever. But both sides realized the importance of using metal for protection, the head of the soldier, and slowly metal helmets came out of World War I as well. Previously, as I said, they didn't exist. They were basically cloth, and cloth is basically worthless in terms of protection. Right. There are many developments we'll talk about, but one of the key elements, and then we're going to later on see a brief documentary, was the introduction of poison gas. Poison gas and the use of poison gas was a violation of international law. There were two Hague Conventions. In 1890, The Hague, of course, is in Holland, and it's where the International Court stands to this day. There was a convention in 1899 and again 1907. In both of those Hague Conventions, a law was passed, a covenant, that chemicals were not to be used as weapons in warfare. Almost everybody signed it, except the United States and Italy. But even the Germans signed, the Prussians, everyone signed it, basically. But that didn't mean everyone abided by it. because, you know, the thing with law is you can always find a loophole. And everyone does. And once the loophole is established by one side, then everyone feels justified. You know, now they're entitled to, you know, fight fire with fire or poison with poison, as the case may be. And so, notwithstanding the fact that it was against international law, poison gas became a very significant part of warfare. And we're going to see this, by the way, in the poems of World War I, when we get to that point in the semester, where it's a major theme that keeps coming up, because the effects of poison gas were beyond horrible. I mean, sometimes you were lucky if it killed you, but even that was a brutal death because it infiltrated the lungs, and it was like drowning on dry land. It was, you had the feeling and the experience of actually drowning because your lungs filled up and you couldn't breathe, but you weren't underwater. It just felt like you were underwater. And it was a slow, miserable death. It seared the lining of your lungs out, or it could burn the flesh of your face off, which it did, or it could blind you, and on and on and on it went. Let's see in more detail. Now, actually, the first use of poison gas was by the French, but the gas that they used was actually tear gas, which, you know, is still used today. Tear gas wasn't the horrible, you know, chemical that came along next. There was, you know, phosgene gas and mustard gas and so on. You'll see all of these, how the one developed after the other. And those are the ones that were most deadly. But even those types of warfare had to be modified along the way, because originally they were just sent over toward the enemy. But, you know, if the winds shifted, then suddenly the guys who sent it across suddenly found that they were the victims of it because the wind shifted and pushed it back in their direction. And we'll see more of that in detail. But the whole use of chemical warfare really is attributed to the Germans. They were the ones who first used the deadly stuff in the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. It's an interesting story how the Germans actually came up with this horrible development, this poison gas and so on. Germany, you remember, only became an empire and united in 1871. Notwithstanding that, Germany progressed to a degree that no other country in the world, I think, ever saw. It had the greatest academies, the greatest universities, the greatest scientists. I mean, it just overnight became a major power, which is why the other countries were afraid of it, in part. There was a guy who is a really interesting story, who is he's known as the father of, you know, chemical warfare. His name was Fritz Haber, Haber, German. And Fritz Haber is actually a very interesting story, and not an uncommon one, actually, in terms of the Jews of Germany. Fritz Haber was born in Breslau. Breslau is in Oberschlesien, it's the northeastern part of Germany. It's now not Germany, it's now Poland. And Breslau is now known as Wrocław. But the maps of Europe changed a lot, as we noted, over the years. And at one point, Breslau was Germany, Oberschlesien. And that's where he was born, into a Jewish family that was pretty active and involved, and certainly affiliated and associated with, you know, the religion. Haber was a brilliant young man, attended the University of Breslau, got a PhD in chemistry. And then he converted. He became a Protestant. Not an unusual phenomenon at that time in Germany, because even though after the unification of Germany, equal rights were part of so the new German Empire to a degree, Jews were no longer forced in ghettos, and they had all sorts of opportunities, educational and otherwise, but there were limits. Jews could not rise anywhere in the army to the upper ranks, and Jews could not achieve the highest positions in universities. As academics, they can only reach a certain level. The only way around it was to convert. The conversion wasn't an uncommon thing. And eventually, Haber converted, became a Protestant, which of course allowed him mobility in his academic career. He would now rise to all sorts of levels within the university. And he quickly became known as this great chemist, right? As I said, and well, we'll say that for later, Germany had some of the greatest minds in chemistry. It's going to come up in that little segment about chemical warfare. The Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, is pronounced in America Bayer, the Bayer Fabrik, the aspirin people, were a very important chemical operation in Germany. Anyway, so this guy, Haber, became very prominent as a chemist and became known, as it says, the father of chemical warfare. And together with another chemist by the name of Bosch, they developed what was known as the Haber-Bosch process, which turned ammonia into nitrogen, which was very important, actually not just in chemical warfare, but also very important actually in creating certain fertilizers in agriculture and so on and so forth. So he was, a pretty important guy. Now he is the guy who intentionally, with the blessing of the Kaiser, came up with, he said, look, we need a quick way out of this war. And so he developed these different poison chemicals that could be delivered in battle against the enemy. And amazingly, it got him the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1918 when the war ended. Now, there were plenty of chemists who were outraged. They were mortified that this guy gets a Nobel Prize for coming up with something that didn't benefit mankind, to put it mildly, destroyed mankind to a great degree. But there was a whole controversy, but he got it. He won the Nobel Prize. In the meantime, along the way, he married a woman by the name of Clara Immerwahr, who was also a chemist, who was also born a Jew but converted to, became a Lutheran, a Protestant, and they married. But she, Clara Immerwahr, was so outraged by what her husband had done. I mean, she was more of a humanist. And chemistry was there to improve people's lives, at least in her mind. And here her husband comes up with this poison gas. And she was so distraught that she actually committed suicide. In the meantime, Haber, though, this famous guy, won the Nobel Prize. But he was sort of persona non grata. It was not, a lot of people within that community did not think much of him. But then, interesting thing happened to Haber and to many of his fellow co-religionists, many German Jews who thought they were more German than anybody. Along came Hitler in 1933 and reminded them otherwise. Fortunately for Haber, he died in 1934 in exile in Switzerland, where he's buried next to his wife. So he really missed the horrors of being a Jew in Germany during the Nazi period. But interesting thing, another interesting quirk of history that's going to tie up with something we're going to talk about later on in the course. What happened was there was a chemist, famous chemist in England. His name was Chaim Weizmann, who was a Russian Jew who left Russia because of the circumstances there and ended up in England. And he became a very famous chemist. And he developed a process in England in World War I that greatly aided the British Army. And it's very interesting. What is the chemical that he came up with? The women in the class will be familiar with this. It's known as acetone. Acetone nowadays is nail polish remover. But in World War I, somehow it had a use that was beneficial to certain armaments, weapons that the British were manufacturing. And so Weizmann was honored by the British government for his contribution and so on, which is going to have a major impact later on. Before we get to that, so Weizmann and Haber actually became friends. Right? They had a lot in common, right? Weizmann was a great Zionist always, and was always a spokesman and the promoter of the Jewish state in Palestine, which is, you'll see later on in the course, is going to play in with what happened in World War I in terms of the Middle East. But in the meantime, Haber was sort of, like I said, persona non grata. Within the chemical community, he was looked down on, not because of his genius, but because of his contribution to chemical warfare in the First World War. And the guy needed a place to go. So what happened was, in his friendship with Weizmann, he suggested to Haber that he go to, was then Palestine, and become connected with became known as the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, which is a university, but it's focused on science, especially chemistry and physics. I actually have a cousin, my mother's cousin, who was a professor there, a physics professor for a long time. So ironically, notwithstanding his conversion to Protestantism, Haber ended up at the institute that became known as the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And that's where he spent the rest of his life. When he died, he was buried, as I said, in Switzerland. Chaim Weizmann, because of his contribution to the British war effort in World War I, and Weizmann's two sons were killed in the Royal Air Force. They were killed in World War I. So the British government, when it came around to it, was sympathetic to his plea for a Jewish state. And indeed, in 1948, Israel emerged, and the first president of the state of Israel was Chaim Weizmann, the chemist. Right? It's a very interesting sort of digression, but everything in history seems to be like a seamless web, everything and everyone connected to everyone else. So Germany then started using, to get back to this, started using these chemicals in the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. So in 1915, then the other countries sort of had to come up with, obviously, the counter chemical, right? And they did. And the United States had a chemical program. Even before we entered the war in 1917, we knew at some point we were going to be there. And we also have to have a program of poison gas and chemicals. And what happened was the American University outside of Washington, D.C., which had been built and it hadn't opened yet. And the government acquired the campus of the American University to develop our chemical capabilities and our poison gas, which was sadly they used dogs to experiment on the potency and the effect of the gas, and thousands of dogs were sacrificed in the process, and a lot of this poison gas seeped into the ground. And as I mentioned, I think earlier on, to this day, when they've been building new subdivisions of houses and so on, they have to deal with all kinds of chemical deposits under the ground and so on. Just one little other sort of footnote to this, a little digression, but like I said, unfortunately, thousands of dogs were sacrificed in the process of the U.S. preparing for World War I, its entry, and its poison gas. When the United States entered the war, we started in 1917, we started sending troops to Europe, to France, under General Pershing. Talk about him, J.J. Pershing, who was the main commander of the U.S. Army. One of the troop ships that was taking the American soldiers over, a couple of the soldiers actually managed to secretly bring a dog on board with them, even though it's against the regulations. And at first, Pershing was mortified that they secreted this mutt onto the boat. But the dog became known as Stubby. That was his nickname, Stubby. And the dog accompanied the U.S. troops in France and so on during the U.S. participation in World War I. Amazingly, this dog developed the ability to sniff out or realize an imminent gas attack. So he would start barking furiously, and then the soldiers knew that their gas canisters on the way over, and they were able to duck and hide or whatever, thanks to this dog. So when the war ended, this dog, Stubby, came back with the troops, but now he was a national hero and became known as Sergeant Stubby. And at Yale University football games, every home game, Yale University, at halftime, they would march him across the field and everyone would stand up and salute to a dog. It saved all these lives. So that's the other side of the story. All those unfortunate dogs were sacrificed as experiments, and then Sergeant Stubby, who saved all those lives, American soldiers. But these chemicals were easily obtainable and they were cheap. And gas was especially effective against the troops. And as I said, they destroyed the respiratory system in a slow and miserable death. Now, they had to come up with some kind of a counter to these gas attacks. We all know, we see pictures, we'll see plenty of pictures when we get to the artwork of, World War I soldiers with gas masks. But the gas mask didn't come along right away, right? Like everything else, it was a process. So in the beginning, they thought that the way to counter the effect of this poison gas, as horrible as the prospect seemed, that did is they would actually urinate into rags and then apply the rag to the face. Somehow this, they thought, and maybe to a certain extent, it sort of neutralized the effect of the gas. And not exactly what you would want on your face, but I guess if it's that or death, I suppose, you got to do what you got to do. But eventually, necessity is the mother of invention. So eventually the notion of the gas mask came around, and it went through different permutations and modifications till the actual gas mask that we're familiar with came about. But that was problematic too, because the glass fogged, but it also was tinted in a certain way. So night viewing wasn't clear, very unclear. And so you couldn't wear this gas mask all the time. First of all, it was hard to breathe. Just imagine now walking around all the time with a mask on. Much worse. The gas mask. So soldiers didn't wear them all the time, but as soon as there was the attack, as soon as someone started screaming, gas, guys, and then the poison was on the way, they would grab the gas mask, hopefully in time, and then put it on. So you had to have it nearby, and they had to be produced in huge numbers. And eventually, industry stepped up and was able, to produce significant numbers of gas masks. But there was other issues that went along with it as well. After World War I, again, there were international conventions against the use of poison gas, but we know that once again they were violated. They were violated by Saddam Hussein. Right? We know he used poison gas. When you look at this brief documentary on poison gas in World War I, the gentleman speaking is going to make a point which I want to sort of clarify, because you might get the wrong impression. He notes quite correctly that what happened was during World War I, Adolf Hitler was a corporal in the German army, which is a long story how he managed that. I mean, he was not German, he was Austrian. But anyway, it's a whole other story. In any case, he was injured by in a gas attack, and he was blinded. It's towards the end of the war. And it looked as though he would never gain his sight back. He was all bandaged up and everything else in a hospital when he found out that Germany had lost the war. That determined his future career choice, that he would take up politics and that Germany would avenge this loss in World War I. As it turned out, I guess you can ask all kinds of questions. You're not going to get an answer. Why exactly did he get his sight back? The course of history would be very different, but he did. At some point, he regained his sight. Because of his experience in World War I, when he now was the chancellor, the Führer, guy in charge of everything, and World War II broke out, which war the Germans started, he determined that poison gas would not be used by the troops in World War II. So Germany did not use poison gas as a weapon in World War II. But what he doesn't mention in this documentary is the Germans used gas in the genocide of World War II. All those concentration camps with their gas chambers used poison gas, Zyklon B. It's a different kind of poison gas, but it was an outgrowth of World War I. So it was only used not in a military context in World War II, it was used only in the genocide and the Holocaust of World War II. Interestingly, some of the, I don't want to go too far astray, but actually the development of some of these gases in World War I, amazingly, later on, were further developed in a positive way and provided some of the first uses of chemotherapy against cancer. So I guess that's the positive that came out of it, right, at some point later on. But I just wanted to clarify that point about the poison gas in World War II. It wasn't that Hitler was a humanitarian. It was because of his personal experiences that he limited its use only to murder, but not to military use. Now, in the beginning, as I said, the gases were delivered as they were toward enemy lines, but a shift in the wind could obviously then turn it back on the ones who were actually the ones projecting it on the other side. So they had to come up with a way to deal with that. And the Germans came up with the idea that they could resolve that issue and manage to not violate the terms of the Hague Agreements by putting the gas in canisters. Because in a strict reading of what the Hague Convention said, you can't fire gas at the enemy. So the Germans said, yeah, but who said you can't put it into a canister and fire the canister at the enemy? When the canister lands, it explodes and then the gas is released. So that's how they rationalized or justified that. But in any case, the different gases were used. You'll see mustard gas, phosgene gas, and so on, because they had to come up with more potent and more deadly kinds of gases as the war went on. I'm going to show you that in a moment or two, I'm going to show you that documentary, but I'll tell you what we're going to go on, because there's a lot more in terms of the weapons of the First World War. Airplanes were used the airplane had just been developed really by the Wright brothers, but airplanes were used, but in the beginning they were used only for reconnaissance because they were flimsy things and they could only fly very low. So the best they could do was at least show you where the enemy was. But they couldn't fly at great altitudes and they were highly flammable. And if you tried to fire let's say, rifles through the airplane. You know, remember the airplanes had propellers, metal propellers, and more often than not, the bullet that you're firing at the enemy bounced off the propeller and killed the pilot. So a guy by the name of Fokker, F-O-K-K-E-R, he has a plane named after him, Dutchman, developed a way, we'll talk about it, that you can actually, that they could fire at that moment when the revolution of the propeller was in between two propeller blades, and it went through the middle. It's an amazing development. So airplanes, as time went on, became very important in terms of World War I, obviously very important in terms of World War II. Same thing with the tank. Good question. Where do they come from? The individual countries developed them in their own industry. That was their big industry, was armaments, especially in Germany. There was a company by the name of Krupp, K-R-U-P-P. The Krupp family, going all the way back to the beginning of the establishment of the Kingdom of Prussia, back in the 18th century, were already producing arms. That's why Prussia was such a militant state, because they had this great arms producer. And the Krupp family followed German history all the way through. World War I, they were the greatest producers of armaments. They were the greatest producers of armaments in World War II. And each country developed its own industry producing armaments. Nowadays, you might have seen this name Krupp, K-R-U-P-P. They don't make armaments so much anymore. I think you mostly see the names on coffee makers. But each country developed its own, you know, armaments industry, and they weren't necessarily selling to each other. In World War II, there was a whole issue about what the British were going to get. The British were having a hard time keeping up with the Germans, and so the United States under Roosevelt started this Lend-Lease program and all kinds of means of providing the British with armaments before we entered the war. But good question. So it was the age of industrialization. Right? Actually, the age of industrialization began a little bit before World War I, so the full swing, and that's what they were producing. That was what the industries were turning out at the time. So there were the airplanes, and then the big thing is the tank. Talk about the tank, how it changed in the course of World War I. First, it was totally ineffective, but it became very important because of the nature of trench warfare and those barbed wire protective, use before the front. Before the trench, how you going to get into it? So the tank is a big, heavy thing. Go right through. Not so simple. The early tanks collapsed, it didn't work, they had wheels instead of treads. But in the course of World War I, the tank was modified and improved and so on. So in World War II, a tank was a big deal. Those tanks went right through the Ardennes forests, right, and all through all kinds of other forests. Tanks are very important. But they also had modifications required because, it's pretty hot inside the tank, when they close the top. So that was also a sort of a product and process of being improved and finalized in World War I. Big thing, the submarine. The Germans had the submarine. And because the Germans had the submarine, we're going to talk about it in more detail, that's why the United States entered the war. Because the Germans were engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare, and they're blowing everything out of the water, including civilian passenger ships and commercial ships and everything else. Plus, they were able to block ports, and the British needed the ports to bring in supplies and food and so on. The submarine is really unique part of World War I. Then there were flamethrowers, and there were these other projectiles, and so on. All of these different weapons, sort of evolved in the course of the war and became more deadly, but more proficient and more accurate as the war wended on for 4 years. And then they found their use and further improvement in World War II. So the use of weapons, we're going to go on with this the next time, we're not really finished, is very important. Also the use railways. I think I mentioned the Germans already built up a railway system pretty early on in the 20th century. And the Allies had an idea that this was not going to be good because they built these rail stations right on the border of Belgium, and there was no reason. There was no commercial reason. There was no practical reason. It just didn't make any sense, other than the Germans were anticipating at some point in the future using railways to transport troops, which we know they did. In fact, the whole war was like on a timetable, a railway timetable, as they moved east and west on both fronts because they had this great rail lines. And so this strategy was one that was in place even before the war broke out. We'll talk more about that, obviously. We'll go on to discuss more of the weaponry. So there were all sorts of developments. The more technologized, the more industrialized society becomes, the more it can produce quickly and efficiently and effectively. And the more sophisticated the weapon. And when you have sophisticated and potentially deadly weapons, generals want to use them. Why have them if they're not going to use them? And they did, right? They were anxious to try them out. And World War I was basically where they tried them out. Now, these things work two ways. And after this, we'll go on to this documentary. Sometimes weapons can be a deterrent. You take a chance. You all are too young, but when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, in the middle of the Cold War, and the Russians were still a pretty powerful force out there with all sorts of threats that they could use. It was President Reagan's idea that maybe we should develop much more powerful weapons, because the fact that we have them would be a deterrent to the Russians, that they would, first of all, at that point, they were not doing well economically. So to be able to keep up with our production would have been more of a drain on their economy than they could have really allowed at the time. But he said, but you know what, it could be that by producing more powerful and effective weapons, they know that we can use them. And therefore they might back down and be more hesitant, to be trigger happy. As it turns out, he was right on a number of counts, and the Russians did back off, and they stopped their production of weapons, in response to ours, plus which the country was collapsing anyway, which helped, right? So sometimes having the upper hand militarily can be a deterrent, and the other side thinks twice. But it's Russian roulette, pardon the pun. I mean, you're taking a chance, and that time it worked out. Here, it didn't. In World War I, each side just had to counter the other side and come up with something more deadly than what the other side had, and it just built up and built up and built up until the horrors of the war and the resultant death and suffering and casualties, fatalities. And we'll see in the artwork and the literature of World War I the long-lasting effect. Because, a lot of soldiers survived, but they survived in a form that they might have preferred the opposite, right? They were so totally maimed and psychologically scarred and so physically destroyed that they, in many cases, they couldn't even be seen in public. In England, there were all sorts of communities that were established for these soldiers who had like half a face and whatever, and they just couldn't be seen in public. It was, it was too devastating for the general population to have to look at this, and they were embarrassed, quite frankly, to be seen like that, or to evoke that kind of a response. So there were these large encampments for victims of mostly poison gas warfare, but also the other armaments of the time. But we'll go on with that next time. Just want to set up the documentary. Excuse me 1 second.
Imagine you're a soldier in any war, anywhere. You're prepared for battle, for the enemy, and you know you might get shot or even killed. Imagine being on the front line though, and suddenly something comes creeping around your legs, a cloud of yellow or green that spreads until you have no choice but to breathe it in, and you begin to gag and to choke as your throat and lungs are eaten from the inside out by the horror of poison gas. I'm Andy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about chemical weapons in the First World War. The stalemate on the Western Front that persisted through much of the war prompted the most intensive use of chemical weapons in history. Despite an 1899 treaty that banned the military use of poisonous gases, all of the nations in the war used them at one point or another, especially during 1915 and 1916. Considered uncivilized prior to World War I, the development and use of poison gas was seen as necessary by the wartime armies, who were desperate to find a new way of overcoming that stalemate of unexpected trench warfare, that war of attrition that claimed thousands upon thousands of lives every month with no gain in territory. Although it is popularly believed that the German army was the first to use gas, it was in fact initially deployed by the French. In the first month of the war, August 1914, they fired tear gas grenades, silyl bromide, against the Germans. But the German army was the first to give serious study to the development of chemical weapons, and the first to use it on a large scale. Let's go back a bit. At the end of the 19th century, many foresaw the devastation that chemical agents could cause in a European war. The Hague Convention of 1899 discussed the issue of using chemicals as weapons, and the signees agreed not to use projectiles whose sole purpose was the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. Now, delegates from all of the attending countries except the United States signed the resolution. A second Hague Convention reaffirmed the provisions on chemical weapons usage and widened the restraints by prohibiting the use of poison or poisoned weapons. Hague II included a clause prohibiting projectiles, weapons, and materials that could cause unnecessary suffering. Prior to the war, all of the future belligerent nations except Italy, the US, and the Ottoman Empire were signatories of Hague II. Both Hague I and Hague II had good intentions to prevent the creation of new and possibly more awful weapons of war, but in reality, the wording of the contracts was pretty confusing and interpretations differed considerably between countries. So, gas. On January 31st, 1915, the Germans used gas for the first time. It was also tear gas, like the French used, and they launched 18,000 shells loaded with it against the Russians on the Eastern Front, but it failed to vaporize, having frozen in the winter temperature. Chlorine gas was used for the first time at the Second Battle of Ypres a few months later. At around 5 p.m. on the 22nd of April, French sentries in Ypres noticed a yellow-green cloud moving toward them, a gas delivered from pressurized cylinders dug into the German front line between Steenstraat and Langemarck. They thought that it was a smokescreen to disguise the advance of German troops. Based on that, all French troops in the area were ordered to the firing line of their trench, right in the path of the chlorine gas. Its impact was immediate and devastating. The French and their Algerian comrades fled in terror. Their understandable reaction created a big opportunity for the Germans to advance unhindered into this strategically important Ypres salient. But even the Germans were unprepared and surprised by the impact of the chlorine, and they failed to follow up the success of the attack. So the gloves were now off, and other nations with the ability to manufacture poison gas could now also use it and blame it on the Germans, as they had been the first to use it. The first of the Allied nations to respond to the Ypres gas attack was Britain in September 1915. The newly formed special gas companies attacked German lines at Loos. When the wind was in a favorable direction, chlorine gas was released from the British front line so that it could drift over to the German front line. This was then to be followed by an infantry attack. However, along parts of the British line, the wind changed direction, and the chlorine was blown back onto the British, causing over 2,000 casualties on their own side, with 7 fatalities. This risk of blowback also affected the Germans and the French in some of their gas attacks in late 1915. Did I say gas attacks? Sorry, the special gas companies were not allowed to call their new weapon gas. It was referred to as an accessory, like a handbag. The horrors of gas warfare caused public indignation both during and after the war. And in 1925, a Geneva Convention outlawed the use of chemical weapons. Adolf Hitler, who had himself been a victim of mustard gas in 1918, adamantly refused to deploy poison gas during World War II. Nevertheless, the major powers retained stockpiles of these weapons, and indeed still do. A chemical weapon is generally defined as a toxic chemical contained in a delivery system, maybe a shell or a bomb. In trench warfare, direct attack was often fraught with difficulties and incurred massive casualties. Chemical warfare was to be an effective way of attacking without direct contact or direct risk. A cloud of gas could be launched toward a line of soldiers sheltering in a trench without danger for the attackers. Now, there were several types of gas used during the war. Here are a few of them. Tear gas. First introduced, as I said, by the French in 1914, tear gas is an irritant and is not deadly. When they first deployed this against the Germans by using hand grenades, the Germans didn't even notice they were using it. One thing here, though, none of the warring nations believed that tear gas was a violation of the Hague Conventions. Chlorine gas. Just a few months later, Germany had the Bayer Company, the aspirin people, come up with a more toxic type of gas to use. The result was chlorine gas, which was a byproduct of dye manufacturing. Okay, chlorine gas looked like a greenish-gray cloud of smoke and was highly visible to the enemy. Chlorine gas is a powerful irritant that inflicts damage to the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. At high concentrations and prolonged exposure, it can cause death by asphyxiation. An initial attack against the Russians that injured some 9,000 of them so inspired them that they too began to practice chemical warfare. Brilliant. Thing is, you need a lot of chlorine to kill people, and gas masks are an effective deterrent. Something stronger had to be created. Thus, phosgene gas. This was the next step in the progression. The French retaliated against chlorine gas with phosgene. Now, phosgene was a potent killing agent, deadlier than chlorine. One semi-drawback, though, was that some of the symptoms of exposure took 24 hours or more to manifest. That meant that the victims were initially still capable of putting up a fight, although this could also mean that apparently fit troops would be incapacitated by the effects of the gas on the following day. Colorless and having an odor likened to moldy hay, phosgene was difficult to detect, making it a more effective weapon. It was sometimes used on its own, but was more often mixed with an equal volume of chlorine to help it spread across the battlefield. Although phosgene was never as notorious in the public consciousness as our next gas, it killed far more people. About 85% of the 100,000 deaths caused by chemical weapons during the war. Mustard gas, the poster child for World War I chemical weapons. As if these chemicals weren't scary enough, mustard gas was unleashed by Germany in 1917. Mustard gas was the most effective and widely publicized gas of the entire war. However, it wasn't a particularly effective killing agent, though in high enough doses it is fatal. The reason it was so terrifying is that mustard gas was painful, caused huge yellow blisters, and incapacitated a person just by touching their skin. Gas masks did not work against this stuff. Not only that, it didn't go away like other gases. When other gases were used against an enemy, they would, eventually disperse. The wind would just blow them away. Not so with mustard gas. It was heavy and sunk into crevices and trenches, then stayed there for weeks, months, even years. So the Germans found that it was quite difficult to attack the enemy with mustard gas and then advance to the enemy's position. When you think about it, compared to the other causes of casualties in the First World War, chemical weapons were relatively ineffective. Only 3% of those who suffered an attack by chemical weapons died. Another 2% were permanently incapacitated, but nearly 3/4 were fit for active duty once again within 6 months. However, blindness, temporary or permanent, was often a side effect of gas, as was respiratory illness. And death by gas was often slow. So you can see why it got its reputation. When those hardest hit were sent home to painfully and slowly die in front of their loved ones over weeks, even months. It was Russia that actually suffered the most casualties by far from gas during the war, around 56,000. But everywhere it was the trench soldiers' greatest fear, and was immortalized in paintings, diaries, and poems, like this one from Wilfred Owen. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone was still yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panels and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Just try for a moment to imagine that horror. We make these special episodes every week or two to go into greater depth into topics that we don't have time to cover properly in our regular weekly episodes. Tell you what, you can check out our special on animals in the war right here. Don't forget to subscribe. See you Thursday.
Okay, that was pretty concise and to the point. Indeed, that poem by Wilfred Owen was one of the poems we'll be looking at. Wilfred Owen, British poet, very interesting story. He, amongst many other poets of the time, spoke about the horrors of chemical warfare and the effect it had on, on the troops. You can see it, although a sort of small amount in terms of total casualties, the effect of the chemicals was brutal. It was just brutal. And as he pointed out, the death was a slow, miserable one, and the lasting effects of those who survived was quite awful in terms of the suffering that they were forced to endure for the rest of their lives as a result of these chemicals that affected them in the many ways that you saw for years to follow. The use of chemicals, obviously, as was pointed out, violated every notion of international law, of basic morality and decency, but that didn't stop the use of these chemicals going forward, and therefore required yet further conventions, Geneva and so on, to try and halt it. But as we know, it wasn't totally effective. So that's one aspect of weaponry of the war. Obviously, as I said, we're going to talk about other ones moving forward. And they had their effect. We're going to see what the submarine warfare did in terms of turning the war in a certain direction and ultimately involving the United States in World War I. So that's yet another important development in terms of developments of introduction of new potent forms of warfare. Any questions? Okay. By the way, I haven't looked at the list of research topics recently, but I'm sure that any one of these individual weapons that we spoke about or will be speaking about make an interesting topic as well. Somewhere I have a documentary on use of airplanes in World War I. I'll see if I can find it. So I would like you to see that as well. And obviously, going forward, some of these had tremendous impact on World War II. Airplanes being one of them, tanks being another one. So it was not a momentary development in history, but rather an ongoing process of evolution in terms of effective means, unfortunately, of killing. I don't know, it's a whole separate topic. It's a topic really that comes up in my Holocaust class. Because you've got to stop and wonder every once in a while, what is this thing we call man, the human being? As far as I know, could be wrong, I have a great sympathy for animals, so maybe that colors my attitude, but I don't think animals just fortuitously kill each other. They kill because they're programmed to eat in certain ways, or they respond to attack or danger also in certain ways. But I don't think I've yet to see a French poodle be attacked by a German shepherd because of a national issue or whatever. I think only human beings do that, sadly. And every time I teach one of these classes, this war, that war, the next war, this genocide or the next genocide, you think the lesson, would be learned. I'm sure it is learned. Unfortunately, the ones that are taking classes are probably the ones that don't need the lesson. It's the ones that are ignorant of history that keep perpetuating it. In any case, we're also going to talk about a very sad and unfortunate genocide in World War I against the Armenians by the Ottoman Turks. So, I don't know. Gotta wonder, are we incorrigible? I don't know. Anyway, any questions, any comments? Okay, so we're going to go on with the discussion of weapons. Let me just check one thing so we don't make yet one more mistake. As I said, weapons were supposed to come later on, but after we finish the weaponry of World War I, okay, we'll probably speak a bit about shell shock. We've alluded to it. And then the march to the front in the, I want to speak a bit about, let's see, well, that comes later. In the East, the war also was carried on in the Eastern Front against Russia. And sort of interesting to see what happened there. The most interesting part of the war in the East actually is what happened in the middle of World War I in Russia, and that's the Russian Revolution. And the end of the Tsar, the end of the Romanov dynasty, and the appearance of communism. And it's a fascinating story within the context of the war. Took the Russians out of the war in 1917. So moving on towards the Eastern Front, but still have more to say about the weapons of World War I. So if there are no questions, I will see you again on Thursday, same time, same place. A couple of points. That documentary about the poison gas is under videos on Blackboard. And this class, like all the others, will be recorded. It might not have been posted yet, but they will be posted shortly, so you can see them all again if you like. And the couple of students had a conflict of one sort or another. All of the classes are recorded, and they will be, if they're not already available, will be available for you to view as well on Blackboard. So stay safe, take care, see you on Thursday.